Our final speaker is Catherine Kling. And Kathy is a Tisch University professor in the Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management at Cornell University and faculty director at the Atkinson Center for a Sustainable Future, also at Cornell University. She chairs the Water Science and Technology Board of the National Academies of Sciences and has been a member of 6 National Research Council studies. Kathy was elected to the National Academy of Sciences in 2015. The title of Kathy's talk is Policy Approaches to Enable Multiple Pathways to Change. Welcome, Kathy, to the Food Forum.
Still on mute. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I've learned already so much from the earlier speakers. I'm hopeful that my contribution will be equally interesting and informative. I was requested to talk about policy approaches. It's clear to me, at least, that policy approaches are very complementary to all of the sorts of producer, supply chain, and consumer approaches, as well as the fascinating design work that we just heard about. First, some quick disclosures. I've received research funding from a variety of places listed here. Currently, I'm on the board of directors at Resources for the Future. As Chris mentioned, I chair the Water Science Technology Board, and I edit a couple of journals. In addition, you can get my full background and other activities on my website, but I thought those were the key ones to mention. So I'm going to start with the themes that I hope will come through in my talk. Theme number 1, I'm going to emphasize repeatedly that incentives drive the food system, just like they drive all economic and non-economic systems. Very important among those incentives are prices, costs, profits. They're not the only incentive. Consumers' preferences, people feeling like they're doing the right thing, these are also valuable incentives. But it is very important to recognize that prices and costs are also very key incentives. Second theme, economic efficiency is the friend of sustainability and the friend of resilient systems. I do not mean that efficiency should dominate. I do not mean that efficiency is always going to be more resilient or more sustainable, but it often will be. Because efficiency is simply using all of our scarce resources without waste in order to provide the most value. That's the definition of economic efficiency. And if we are not doing that, we are not able to produce as much value for as many people, and hence we challenge sustainability. Theme 3, there are important ways in which markets that do not function to produce efficient outcomes. These, in economics parlance, we call them market failures. What we mean by that is they fail through just market processes to have the most efficient outcomes. These are classic economic problems. We fully understand that markets, when these problems are present, do not provide efficient outcomes. Pollution, classic externality, is an important one. When there are information asymmetries or lack of information amongst some parties, markets will not be efficient. If there are very powerful firms who control prices and decisions, markets will not be efficient. In these cases, market inefficiencies occur, and we need, in most cases, policy to correct them. The goals we've talked about and heard from yesterday and today in terms of the food system transformation, I put my own short list here. You've seen them presented earlier. Chris did a nice job, as have others, but just as a sort of reminder, key among them are nutritious diets that are affordable and healthy, We want farm workers and farm employees to be profitable. We want safe working conditions. We want a lot of environmental sustainability that we didn't used to worry as much about, but now are very much on top of interests. Greenhouse gas emissions, water quality, air pollution and odors, wildlife habitat, biodiversity are all areas in which food systems have direct impact and generate externalities. Concerned about animal welfare, food safety, and more. So it's a broad categorization. What I want to do now is talk about briefly the types of market inefficiencies that we see in the food system. So I'm just do some quick definitions. And then I'm going to talk about which of those goals are impacted by these market inefficiencies. Externalities, particularly those with a public good nature, are defined as unintended side effects of market production or consumption that imposes costs on others. The public good aspect of that is that many people receive the benefits or bear the costs, regardless of whether they're involved in a market for purchasing them or not. Carbon greenhouse gases are a classic externality unintentionally released by the production of fossil fuels and many activities that cause damage around the world. Classic example. Market power is another market inefficiency. When two small firms, a few sellers or buyers control the market, they can control price and reduce efficiency. Information is another source of market inefficiency that we see in the food sector in some cases. And this is just the idea that people need to know the risks and benefits. They need to know what food is healthy. They need to know the risks associated with doing farm work or any other kind of labor activity in order to make good decisions about whether to participate in those markets. In each of those different cases, there are different policies that are appropriate in reaction. And that's something I really want to emphasize. There cannot be one size fits all. In the case of the food system, there are many, many problems. That means there's going to be many, many different types of policy interventions that will probably be required, some of which we already see, others of which are nowhere near at the scale needed if we are serious about addressing problems. If we're talking about externalities, and I list those examples here, greenhouse gas emissions, air pollution, water pollution, then appropriate policy tools are to tax and have a polluter pays paradigm, to regulate, have a cap and trade program. If the problem is something very different, say market power, then the appropriate policy tool is to deal with that directly through antitrust regulation or some other form of government requirements. If it's an information problem, if people do not understand what is safe and nutritious, or they don't understand the risks of certain behavior, then we have a very different policy tool, education, public service information, and so on. Each of these is an intervention by policy that can level the playing field for everybody involved in the supply chain, in the consumer interface, and in the food system as whole. They contribute to solutions along with and motivate and activate all the different sorts of supply chain producer responses that we've heard about. I want to finally note that there's another cause that does not fit under the category of that economists think about as market failure. Markets, for better or worse, are pretty agnostic about fairness and equity. So we don't think of them as market failures per se, but many people, myself included, believe that these are very important issues and we need to address them. The key point is we need to think about addressing them with different sorts of policy approaches. Social safety nets, women, infant, children program we've heard about, poverty reduction programs in the long run, education and training. My primary purpose in all of that conversation was to emphasize that some of the things that we're talking about in transforming the food system have to do with market failures, classic economic problems that we understand, and we understand how to address them with policy. Others of them have more to do with fairness, with income, and those need to be dealt with in separate ways. This chart is kind of big and confusing. The real take home, I'm not going to spend the time to go through it. The real take home here is that for every different type of problem, you need to understand the incentive causes and then recognize that there are different policy options that you're going to want to undertake. For the rest of my talk, I thought what I would do is, instead of staying at that more generic level, I would dive down a little deeper into a particular example. We heard some fascinating work about Dannon and its work with interventions with farmers through supply chain management. I think that's a great example to contrast with what I'm going to be talking about, which is a very large agricultural system that covers about 2/3 of the United States. What you're looking at here is the Mississippi Atchafalaya River Basin. It ultimately drains to the Gulf of Mexico. This is the world's fourth largest river basin, covers about 40% of the continental US. The region is home to almost 2/3, less than 2/3, 57% of US farmland. 57%. I want to emphasize that because the scale of the issues and the size of the geographic region and the number of players is really important in understanding why policy is essential if we are going to address the environmental and other issues in this system. It is home to over 300 animal species. 60% of migratory birds fly over and through it, so it's important for habitat. It also has some of the worst nutrient pollution in the country. And by nutrients, I'm referring to nitrogen and phosphorus. Harmful algal blooms occur in all of the basin states with increasing frequency. And it has a large and growing dead zone at the outlet of the basin. Let me start with sort of some cool stuff about the incredible productivity of this system. I just think this is such an interesting map. This is from NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, and you can see as it describes, this is a fluorescent glow that measures the amount of photosynthesis that is occurring in July in that range, which basically is the Farm Belt. It is the world's, in that metric, it is the world's second most productive system, the other being the Brazilian rainforest. It is incredibly productive in growing what is grown there. What is grown there? Corn, soybeans, wheat. I pulled up this year's USDA's prospective plantings. They're always off a little bit. It changes over the season, but the gist of it will be unchanged. They're projecting for this year almost 100 million acres of corn, 84 million acres of soybeans, and 45 million acres of wheat. There's over 200 million acres planted in those commodities. It's an interesting comparison to the really the fascinating work that we heard about from Dannon. But keep in mind, they were able to work with growers on 60,000 acres. This is 230 million. What is that grown for? US domestic corn use and soy would be very similar. Take a look at the 2016-17. The yellow amount is the amount of corn, around 5 billion of the 12 billion bushels produced each year goes to ethanol, fuel. It's not food even, it's fuel. The blue goes to food, but only indirectly through animal feed. This corn is being grown and processed and fed to poultry, livestock, and other protein sources. The direct amount that you could say actually even goes to what we might most closely think of as food is really quite small. And that's oil and sugars and so on. Why am I emphasizing that? Because the kind of market interventions that can occur so well in an organic market or in markets where there is a close tie between what people purchase at the supermarket and locally grown, those kinds of market interventions simply will not work when you have an enormous system where we are growing essentially a commodity for lowest cost consumption. This central US has a lot of environmental footprint, and it's largely bad. Here's a picture. It's not specific to the Corn Belt, the central, but is for overall agriculture. About 10% of greenhouse gas emissions comes from ag. Clearly, in a simple world, an appropriate policy response is a carbon tax or a cap and trade, with a way in which to actually return compensation to farmers who sequester carbon. And those kinds of systems can and should be encouraged. Water quality. This is a highly impacted region. EPA's data shows a good chunk of the rivers and streams and lakes are in poor condition. And the single largest source, not surprising, is agriculture. There's been a significant reduction in wildlife habitat and biodiversity. The picture over here shows the original green area were tallgrass prairies. Now only the red components of those remain, which has had, of course, a significant impact on wildlife. Similar story with wetlands. Much of the central part of the US has lost 90% or so of their original wetlands, which were very important for a number of wildlife. Finally, the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico is an annually recurring zone. It is a consequence of nutrient-rich materials contributing to algae bloom and phytoplankton growth, which die, and then as they fall through the water column, removing oxygen from the system. The size of the dead zone varies year to year. What you're looking at here is Texas, Louisiana. That's the entire bottom part of Louisiana. This was the size of the zone last year. And it's typical, it'll be higher, lower, depending on a variety of factors. State of Connecticut size is what it's commonly referred to. The vast majority of the nutrients are coming into it from the Gulf. In this case, what is key to solving the problem, if we choose to decide it's worth solving this problem, we would need to reduce and optimize fertilizer use in a very large amount of the land. And we have to change how farming is done in this region. That would have to be done according to some work done through the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy on 90% of agricultural land in the region. Keep that idea in mind about the magnitudes we're talking about. What could we do? What policies could be undertaken? Well, we need to reduce and optimize fertilizer use. we could impose taxes. How do we go about changing how farming is done? We could regulate, just like we regulate for health and safety in restaurants and require that certain behaviors be done, that certain practices be undertaken, hand washing and so on. We could do the same thing in agriculture. We could require cover crops, erosion control, wetlands, bioreactors. We could take some of that tax and use it to also publicly fund some of these activities, to make a public-private sharing of those costs. This will increase prices. We shouldn't kid ourselves, but that's good, because then we will have aligned the incentives in the system. Things that cost more because of the pollution that they're doing will be properly priced, and people will have the incentive to buy things that are actually currently imposing more costs. I have some data about context of the cost in case people were curious about that. And I also have some information about these kinds of regulatory systems that have actually been done and successful in Florida. But I don't want to take the time. I suspect I'm pretty much pushing my 20 minutes. So I want to just click to my final screen and hope that these are some of the ideas that I've been able to relay. Multiple goals mean you're going to have multiple responses. No one size fits all. Policies should address the core problem as directly as possible. If carbon and greenhouse gases are the problem, then we should focus on addressing carbon and greenhouse gases with taxes and let that work through the system in higher prices and incentives to find new approaches. Policies level the playing field. They allow supply chain management. They allow consumer preferences to be more easily implemented. They all work together. And finally, again, when you have fundamental market failures, like it or not, the solutions require policy interventions at large scales. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. We've got a little time for a question just based on your presentation before we move into the general discussion. And we've got one that I think, to frame it a bit, seems to address the problem of what if you have multiple problems, as you illustrated in the Mississippi River Basin, but maybe they're not all of equal priority. That's my introduction to the question. And the question is, the IPCC published its first report warning of climate change in 1990. How long are we going to have to wait for markets to solve global heating?
To solve what?
Global heating or global warming.
Oh, well, they're not going to. That is the point. We have to have policy intervention. Markets simply will not do it. That's economics 101. It is a market failure. It is an externality. The only way to solve major externalities is to have policy intervention. Carbon tax, a worldwide cap and trade system, markets will not do it. So perfect question. I'm sorry if in any way, shape, or form I suggested the opposite. Markets will not solve that problem.
Thank you. Got another question for you. Great presentation. Is there any documentation of how much of the nutrients fueling the Gulf of Mexico dead zone are, number one, chemical fertilizers, number two, soil runoff, and number three, livestock manure?
Yes. USGS and several other places provide documentation, and I would be happy to point you to those if you send me an email, ckling@Cornell. That'd be the easiest. But yes, that's been well studied and well documented.
Great, thank you. And it's all of those actors were named because they all contribute, clearly.
Yes.
All right.
And other sources. As do other sources. There's some air deposition. There's also municipalities, golf courses, and so on. But in the Midwest, there's such a large amount of land that's in agriculture. it just stands to reason, and it is the case that the largest percent comes from agricultural land.
Well, that kind of raises a follow-up question, which we only have a brief amount of time for, but I can't help but ask it, which is, how does the policy process get affected when you have multiple contributing sectors and they all require different policies? So thinking maybe less about the Mississippi River Basin, more maybe about the Chesapeake Bay
Ah,
Basin, which has a little bit more evenly distributed impact from different sectors, municipalities versus agriculture.
mhm. Well, in the Chesapeake, as in many places, there are goals, TMDLs referred to, of how much reduction should come from different sectors, and those are important and useful starting points. The difficulty with much of the TMDL process is that they are not requirements, and they, as a consequence, because these are fundamental market failures, you can desire people to step up and make changes, but they simply don't have the incentive to do that. So whether it's municipalities, whether it's urban areas, whether it's agriculture, uh, the markets will not incentivize large scale change, but policies can do that. Requirements, taxes, we know how to do this. Of course, there's a great deal of political pushback. I'm not a political scientist, so I can't help with that. What I need to do as an economist is just keep saying, we know about market failures and we know what has to be done if we are serious about changing these things. If not, we will stay the course.
So am I correct to say then that you'd have to, if there's still a market failure in one of the sector's contributions, then that's perhaps a sign of a policy in need of being put in place, or that a policy needs to
Yes.
be put in place? Great.
Yes, absolutely.